All right, testing is dead. Now what? Hi, everyone. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. Today, we're very excited to have Chris Hartjes with us today. Chris is one of the PHP's best-known automated testing advocates, and let's have a great session about automated testing together. Let's go, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I know that a friend of mine, Ben Edmonds, had done one of these, and he recommended I check it out. So, given that Fridays where I work are for me, where I don't have to do any other work, this seemed like a natural fit. So before we kind of get into it, I know people are always interested to find out a little bit about myself and why you should be paying attention to what I have to say. So for me, I've actually, when I sat down and thought about it, I've been thinking about and advocating testing for an extremely long time, almost 10 years now. Because I've been doing programming for a long time on the web, 16 years and counting, mostly with PHP. And I was, I guess, lucky enough to have an experience early on in my career where if I'd known about testing, it would have made my life so much easier. I worked for an adult dating website, and we were about to launch, and the code was terrible. There was lots of mistakes, and the launch went horribly, and there were all sorts of problems. And in the aftermath of it, I wanted to find a way to make sure I never had to do what I had to do, which was work 120 hours of overtime in 6 weeks leading up to Christmas. So I was determined to never, ever, I'd rather quit and go back to working in a grocery store than do that again. So I discovered extreme programming, and through extreme programming, I discovered unit testing, and the landscape for testing in PHP was much, much different back then, 10 years ago. There was, excuse me, PHP unit wasn't available in a public release. None of the other support tools were out there. There were very few, even very few open source web application frameworks. So the landscape was extremely different. I could count on one hand the number of people that were as interested in or knew as much about testing back then that I did. So I had to teach myself a lot of stuff. And so now I'm extremely happy to see that 10 years later, I am no longer the only one, and there are lots and lots of people who are interested in testing. So before I start, we're gonna do like question and answer, because I didn't really want to do any kind of slideshow or anything like that, because I thought that would be, and I apologize because I swear quite a bit. I just think it would be boring as fuck, and I would rather like take some questions from people. But first, I'm going to kind of talk about where we are in terms of testing in the community. I know that earlier this year at RailsConf, David Hannemeyer Hansen had declared that TDD was dead, and there were so many other better alternatives to do testing with. So I wanted to talk for like another couple minutes, just kind of about where I see that we are in terms of the tools and what our options are. And then I will be happy to answer questions until 2 o'clock or however long Whiting wants us to go. So right now where we sit, we actually have, I think we're at a point where we actually have too many choices for tools. Maybe I say that as being a grumpy old man on the internet, but sometimes too many choices is bad. So if we look at kind of the testing that we want to do, we do have a couple of options. If we want to do unit testing, PHP unit is still going, nice and strong, 10 plus years later. Sebastian Bergman and other contributors keep working on it. So it's still the tool I recommend to everybody who wants to get into testing. I think that unit testing actually gives you the biggest return on the amount of time that you're going to spend on it, because it allows you to focus on your code at the module level and make sure that all your little modules of code, an analogy I like to use is Lego blocks, so that everything that are Lego blocks, you snap them all together to create awesome applications. If you're more interested in the kind of behavioral driven development stuff, Behat is out there. Behat is very good for that. I use Behat to do automated front-end testing of applications, because you can hook it up to a browser. I usually do a lot of stuff with headless browsers like Phantom.js. So I can write up tests to simulate entering values into a form and clicking submit and logging people in, and just kind of doing all the stuff that a user would normally do. And then once we get it past unit testing and then using the kind of functional type testing with Behat, we have a whole bunch of other tools that are out there. A lot of them are kind of hybrid tools. They're not really fully behavioral style, but they're not fully unit. We're talking about things like Codeception, PHP Spec. There's another one out there that people have asked me to take a look at called, I have no idea how to pronounce it, but it's Atoun, so Atoun. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. So there are a couple like options if you don't like the unit testing style. But I think the bottom line is, I think that if you look at generations of programmers, I think if you liken it to like college or university cycles, 3 to 4 years. So I've been involved in, I guess we're getting towards the third generation of programmers who have been having testing as an option shoved into their faces because the tools are all available. So I've seen some changes. I like the adoption. Still lots of work to do. Still lots of advocacy, which I spend a lot of time doing. And then still there's a lot of tools and skills that developers are not being taught that would make their life a lot easier as they try to figure out how to do testing. So yeah, I'm happy to kind of take questions from people and answer things as well as I can.
All right, guys, let's start asking questions.
Hey, Chris, this is Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey there. So I guess I'll just open this up. I have never written a unit test. I have looked into all sorts of different BDD stuff. It's just so damn confusing. We end up just pushing hot fixes all the time, never write tests. It's almost like we're getting our users to test stuff out for us. You know, we do extensive testing on our own side. We just use staging server, development server, production. You know, it seems to be working okay, but my brain keeps telling me that I need to try to migrate towards a new setup. It's like we run a really, really big project right now, and I don't even know where to start. It's like what we have in production, I feel like I need to set something up. So what would you give advice for somebody who's trying to get into the BDD or even just PHP unit stuff?
Sure.
You know, site.
Yeah, sure. So there's actually, you bring up two really good issues. So I'll address the first one, where you guys are stuck in the cycle of the users testing your application and then you creating hot fixes in response to what the users bugs that the users have found. So I mean, you're not alone. There are many web applications that use the users of the application basically as free QA people. Okay, so you're not alone. So I mean, that's not the problem with that type of scenario is it's not a tenable one. It's okay at the beginning, maybe when your app first comes out there, because maybe the app doesn't have a lot of exposure. But the longer the app is available and the more critical it becomes to other people's success, eventually the users are going to rebel and realize that they're being used as testers. And you may see a significant number of people just not want to use your stuff anymore, or even worse, start talking shit about your product. So that's kind of, it's a fine line to walk. And I understand that there is a tendency to kind of pressure, there's this constant pressure. I mean, where I work right now, so what I do is, I'm a consultant, but I'm a full-time consultant for somebody else. So I spend my time, I don't write a lot of code, but I spend an awful lot of time looking at processes and getting people to change the way that they're doing things. And so even I feel a lot of pressure with time constraints. Features have to get done, work has to get done. Not everything can stop so we can get tests done. So that's a pressure that leads to the hot fixes in production, or even worse, debugging things in production. So that's a very difficult cycle to get out of. So what I can suggest is that you can do these things in parallel. You can keep doing the hot fixes to keep the users happy, but at the same time, what you're saying is that you hear this voice saying to you that you need to get something done, right? You need to get something done. So really what the issue that we're talking about is there's two things. Developers generally aren't taught how to write tests, right? This really doesn't happen. I went to college years and years ago, and like almost 20 years ago was when I first went to school for it. So testing was definitely not taught, not any kind of formalized testing. And when people are generally learning programming languages, whatever one it happens to be, the number of like beginner examples that actually deal with testing there, I don't know, I could probably count on one hand the number of tutorials I find for beginning programmers. So that's an issue. So people have to learn these things on their own. And my experiences are they're extremely difficult to learn on their own. So you need to find other people that already know how to do the testing stuff. And that can be difficult because generally speaking, a lot of those people are like me. They have full-time jobs and commitments, and their ability to consult or mentor during regular business hours can be extremely difficult. So Ryan, I definitely feel your pain about how you don't even know where to start. But the thing that we're really talking about is not so much the testing, but getting into you guys already do testing. You already have development servers and staging servers. So that's great. So that puts you like ahead of like 90% of the other shops out there. So that's good. But the bigger issue is what you need to do is you need to get all these things automated. Because like I've told in numerous presentations, computers are great at doing what you tell them over and over again. So rather than what you don't want is to be doing all this manual testing, you want a computer program to be doing all this testing. So if you have an app that's in a state that you don't really have time to go back and like write unit tests, which again, I feel is the most effective use of your time. But there's definitely things you can do to write automated tests to test the flow of the application and test the most critical things. And then what you end up with is a test suite that reflects how people are actually using your application, and that most of and then you'll know instantly when something's busted out of your regular user flow. I mean, I don't know what type of work you do, but a typical thing would be users always have to be able to log in. Users always have to be able to sign up. Users always have to be able to use the functionality that's the most popular, whatever the application happens to be. This is especially even more critical if you're doing some kind of e-commerce thing, because I work for e-commerce sites, and there's a reason Amazon sat down and figured out how much money that they lose every minute that they're down, right? Because the ability of people to not use your application is going to cost them money for sure, and it might cost you money. So in a long roundabout way, I think what it's worth doing is investing your time looking in things like BHAT. BHAT plus Mink. BHAT is the behavioral driven development framework. I found it extremely easy to use. Documentation is a bit all over the place, so you sometimes have to hunt around to find out how to get it to do things. I keep meaning to write a book about it, but I keep deciding if I want to devote another 100 hours of my life to writing a book. It's a tough call. But if you combine it with Mink and you have a browser, then you can actually write all these tests to simulate a user logging in, to simulate signing up, to simulate trying to purchase something with a dummy credit card that can be used for testing. So my suggestion to get started is just take a look at something like BHAT. I mean, of course, being biased, I could tell people you can buy my books. My books give you a foundation for getting into unit testing, but I do still have some work to do to kind of show people, if you've never done it before, here's the best way to do it. But BHAT plus Mink is probably your best bet if you have an application that's already up and running, already providing value, people are already using it, and you can't afford to have a catastrophic failure. So does that kind of answer your question, Ryan?
Yeah, it does. This is just a confusing area altogether for me. I feel like I got a little bit of information on how to use BHAT, but as soon as I get into it, I realize that framework-specific tests are a little bit different. Setups are always different, and I'm just sick and tired of following a tutorial. I feel like I'm wasting time trying to learn this crap too.
No, I definitely sympathize. Like I said at the intro, when I got into testing, there was nothing out there, and I had to figure out everything myself. So I learned to be tenacious and dig around. But I don't see why everyone has to suffer the way that I did. I don't think that's cool. I don't believe in the idea of that suffering builds character, and that people should figure out everything on their own. I think that's nonsense. I think it's elitist. And every time I have conversations like this, I realize how much I have taken for granted and how much I need to get out of my head and into electronic form so other people can benefit. So I'm just going to make some notes. And definitely, I hear this a lot about more tutorials for beginners if you've never done these things. I do have screencasts that I have planned to do that kind of help guide people, but unfortunately those are not available yet. I still have to record them and edit them and everything else. So hang in there. Basically what you're doing with all this testing stuff is that you're trying to shift the cost of fixing the bugs to the cheapest part of the developer's work cycle instead of the most expensive. The cheapest being when the developer is actually doing the initial work, with the most expensive being that everybody's in panic mode because the app is broken in production.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's a fine line between, just doing self-testing and doing these automated unit tests, but I struggle to find out how many unit tests to even write. What's the most important thing to do if you're starting from scratch? How do you take a look at your current setup and say, you know what, I'm starting from scratch. So, what unit tests? What are the most important?
I have a good idea, and then I think we got to take a question from somebody else. But what I generally advocate to people, that if they can get whatever testing framework that they're going to use in place, and they've made the commitment that they want to write tests, the first test to actually write is to prove that a bug that somebody else has reported existed. If you have a user, or if you have someone to track the bugs, you just say, okay, from this point onwards, every single bug that comes in, we're going to write a test to verify that the bug actually exists. And then we're going to use that test and refactor our code until the test passes with the correct behavior. You figure out how it's supposed to behave, write a test that expects the proper behavior, and then just keep working on your app until the test passes. That to me, that is probably the one that's going to give you the most impact. Sure, you have that pain up front of learning how to write the test, but instead you end up with a test suite that actually reflects the problems that the app actually has. I mean, you can use code coverage tools. You can have a goal of 100% code coverage, but with a legacy app, that's probably impossible and really a big waste of your time. So picking bugs people have reported and writing tests until they pass is probably the most impactful thing you can do when you're starting it.
Sounds good. Thanks, man.
Next victim. So Whiting, how are people supposed to do this? Choose to raise their hand or just blurt out their questions? How do you want to handle this?
Yeah, usually people just shout out questions.
Well, I guess everyone's testing experts now. This is good.
Chris, hey, Chris, why don't you just ask everybody why they're in this meeting? Let's start off by asking the question.
I heard somebody else had a question first.
Well, this is Bill. I was going to follow up a little bit on what Ryan had just said and your advice to him, which is interesting. I like that. Once you've pretty much tested your bugs, is there a best approach or a best path to follow to start applying and writing tests for other components of the application? Or would you look for what if this fails would cause the most damage or would be the most irritating to a customer or would cause the most headache for the admins later? Is there a best path for that?
I don't know that there is. I tend to recommend to people, like, first of all, the first approach that I had, which was work on the bugs. So write tests with the correct behavior, prove that the bug actually exists, then, refactor your code until the tests pass. But I think then the next step is you also say anything new that we do. We sit down before we assign the work to somebody. I mean, I don't know how it is where other people work, but I work, I've worked for the past number of years at places that use ticketing systems like Jira and other things like that. So nothing gets worked on without a ticket. Nothing gets worked on without stories about what needs to be done, being agile. And more importantly, nothing gets worked on without the person who wants the work done saying, here's what I think needs to happen for me to accept this thing. So basically what you're trying to do is get other people to write testing scenarios for you. And then you can turn those things into tests for whatever framework whatever framework or tools you're happening to be using. And then you just, again, you write those tests first and then keep writing code until those tests pass. So get all those bugs taken care of first, and then anything new, tests have to come with it. And then you have to get really ruthless with not only pushing code from like development to staging and staging to production. You have to also get ruthless in your code reviews. And I hope people are doing code reviews because that's probably the number one thing that you can do to improve the quality of your code and make it testable is by having really good code reviews where people understand the purpose is to criticize the code, not the developer. And so nothing moves from one stage to another without there being tests written and tests that pass. So I think if you kind of start applying that sort of logic, again, you'll be surprised at how quickly you end up with a test suite with pretty good coverage of the things that are critical to your application and that reflect how people are really using your app. So Bill, does that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly. It's a little bit different for me because I tend to be either the sole developer on the project or only involved with maybe one or two other people. So you don't have all the steps that you might have in a large company or for working with a large team. So it's how much does that
Oh, I
when it's
lost
kind of
you
a one-man show and you've got to figure it all out yourself.
Well, I mean, okay, like time pressures are time pressures, right? Deadlines don't change. Um, so a lot of it comes down to how much ability you have to push back and say that I can't get this done because I'm not 100% confident the fixes are going to work. I mean, you kind of broke off a little bit for me at the end there, but I kind of thought that was kind of one of the questions. Like, if time pressure stuff has to get done, I mean, I typically don't work for really large companies, so so I am familiar. Though I have worked for big ones, but I mean, I am familiar with the whole process of like, you need to push back and say, look, you guys want these things to go out perfect, but you're applying a lot of pressure for us to get done, and the pressure is causing us to ship things that aren't perfect. So we need to kind of, it's the old fast, cheap, was it fast, cheap, and good? That whole dichotomy. It's like, or that the tripod that you put code on. It's like one of these three things has to give. And, the people who make the decisions above you are the ones that they're the ones that have to be okay with it. And those are the ones that you always have to push back on. And my experience has been, if you're reasonable with them and you kind of show them this is what we're trying to do. And if you highlight all the time that this thing broke because we didn't have time to check it properly, this other thing broke because we didn't have time to check it properly. I think all but the most, maybe a bad word, but I think it's actually applicable. Only the most incompetent managers and stakeholders are going to look at that and say, slowing down to make sure everything that goes up into production works the way that we expect is a bad idea. I mean, I get it. There's time pressures. There's deadlines that are out of our hands. I always try to have a say in the scope of work and the deadlines as well. Doesn't always work. But I mean, my best advice to you is just there are ways to present the case and to say things are getting busted because you're pushing too hard and we're juggling too many things and everything's going out 80% done instead of a smaller subset going out 100% done.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So I saw that Lewis had a question. So I'll read it out for everybody's benefit here. So it says, I'm starting work on a project where my role will be to write automated tests. It's new for the company. They want to use Selenium, but I thought PHP Unit was the de facto way for automated tests. Where should I stand? Also, what's best to test and not to test? And do you have any advice for when the person writing the test is different from the person writing the code? Okay, so I'll address the Selenium thing first. So for those that don't know, what Selenium is an add-on for web browsers that kind of allow you to record your interactions. It's most commonly like a plugin for Firefox is the way that I've mostly seen it used. And you basically record your sessions that you're doing, and then you can play them back. And as you watch, you can see if errors happen because you're literally watching someone. The browser basically repeats what you did at the same pace that you did as well. So it kind of acts like you. So I find it's an interesting tool for looking at the UI of your application. But the problem with using Selenium is that it's not shareable. There is no easy way to move those Selenium tests that you've written from person to person. I've seen companies twist themselves into knots with remote desktops and shared folders online and try to share the scripts that Selenium saves to share them between their testing team. And I mean, I find that these companies are spending more time trying to keep all that stuff in sync than actually going about the process of writing tests. So Selenium covers one type of thing, just that the application itself is working correctly. It doesn't handle integration tests. It doesn't handle unit tests, and it's not shareable. And so that's generally a reason why I recommend, if you want to use Selenium, you just make it a little teeny tiny part of your whole testing strategy, that you're far better off, again, investing time at the code level, making sure that all the components that you're writing that make up your application work correctly. And so the second question is, what's best to test and not to test? I touched upon it a little bit earlier. if people are really looking to do kind of the UI testing, I highly recommend you write tests for the functionality for your application that is most critical, whatever that happens to be. Again, logins, user signups. If you do something that involves e-commerce and purchasing things, always have to make sure that users can buy things. If you're doing, like if users log in and they have like a dashboard where they can look at the status of their account, those things all have to work. So anything to do with the website that if it wasn't working would be catastrophic to the business and to the application itself, those are the things I recommend you tackle first. And then it becomes like a confidence thing, because then what it means that you no longer have to worry, is this push going to break the front page of the website? Because you'll know, because you ran these automated tests, whatever they happen to be, whatever form they happen to be in, you've run them before you push things to production. So you will know instantly if you've broken something. Because that's, again, this is all about moving the cost of bugs to the cheapest possible part of the developer cycle. I'll talk about this really quick. I've said it in presentations. I really feel it's like a multiplier type thing. Bugs found by the developer when they're working on it is 1x. Bugs found by somebody else are 2x. Bugs found in staging are 5x. Bugs found in production may be 100, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000 times as expensive to fix as if the developer had been given an opportunity to write automated tests. I mean, you could have a bug that destroys your company, that wrecks everything that you've built because nobody was given the time to create automated testing systems to make sure that a catastrophic bug couldn't occur. So I hope that that answers the question. Someone just talked about if you're saying Codeception or Make. Okay, so I mentioned that Selenium. What happens is that you can use those other tools like Codeception and Behat that uses a Selenium style of API and uses Selenium more as an interpretation level to drive the browser. You still can't take something like Behat and import a script that you created using Selenium itself. Doesn't work. Behat plus Mink and using Selenium as kind of like an interpreter thing, those are meant to be run automated in a headless system. I've set them up many times using a continuous integration server like Jenkins. I'm looking into trying to get it working on Travis CI because I've started using Travis for some of my projects as well for continuous integration. You want solutions that are easily automated so you can spend your time writing code and not sitting and not manually refreshing web pages. So Lewis, thank you for the question. And Justin, thank you for the follow-up question. Okay, so we have another question. There's a follow-up one from Justin, and I'll answer this one real quick. What if your app relies on a lot of JavaScript and you want integration tests? Can't use a headless browser. Is there anything you can do about the speed? No, you can't, because you have the overhead in your test of spinning up a browser, even if you're not using a headless one. I've done this on my own laptop. I did it as a demo for my, I have 2 kids at home, so the youngest will come into my office to talk to me while I'm working, and she's watched me spin up like 20 instances of Safari to do a bunch of tests. You have an unavoidable overhead of spinning up a browser. For headless ones, it's a lot smaller than it is for full-fledged browsers. Automated UI testing is expensive in time. It takes a lot. Like you can have a test suite with thousands and thousands of unit tests that can run a lot quicker than one single test that is using a browser. So sorry. Next question that I see was from Matt. How to smoothly integrate testing into a pre-existing project, and generally speaking, how to get into the mindset to write code that is compatible with automated testing. Okay, so how do you smoothly integrate it? There is no way to smoothly integrate because generally speaking, an application that was not written with testing in mind will actually, the app through its architecture and your code decisions will actually push back and make it hard to implement things, especially if you haven't written things with dependency injection. If you're using a lot of things like register globals and other just basically any kind of architectural decisions for your app that make it difficult to inject dependencies in, will make it hard to test. My experiences with adding tests to a project where there aren't any is I generally approach it by I get my testing tool of choice set up. Then I use, we're talking about PHP unit, I will then use Xdebug and its code coverage capabilities to take a look and see, okay, do we have any code coverage at all? If we don't, then I'll talk to the stakeholders for that project and say, okay, what are the most critical things about this application, and get some tests written to protect ourselves against changes. If we do have existing tests, then I start looking at things that have an extremely low level of code coverage and start writing tests to fix those. Again, very tough slog to go to an existing project that doesn't have any tests. Okay, so someone asked, talk more about Travis CI and why I'm not using it more. So for those who don't know what Travis CI is integration server, continuous integration server. Basically what you end up getting set up, it integrates very nicely with GitHub. Anytime you push your code up to GitHub, you can set hooks up so that a notification is sent to Travis CI system, and they basically spin up, I don't know exactly what they're using, but they set up little virtual machines, and they will check out your code, and they can do all sorts of stuff. I use it to run my automated tests for an open source project that I work on called OpenCFP. It's for a call for papers app for conferences. So I get it to run all my tests. It's very handy because, again, it's automating something for you that you don't have to worry about. So anytime code gets pushed, it runs all the tests, and and then if something's broken, I get an email saying that something's broken. So I find it extremely helpful because, again, it's just one more thing that I don't have to worry about. So I hope that answers that question. So we go down. Can I describe the differences between PHP unit, BHAT, and PHP spec? Okay, so that's actually quite easy. PHP unit is for unit testing. You can use it to write integration tests, but those capabilities are kind of bolted on afterwards. It's strictly for writing unit tests, and by unit tests, I mean writing tests for one specific unit of code, usually an object, and you write tests to make sure that you set dependencies for that object, and you write tests to verify that that unit of code behaves the way that you want. Something like BHAT is more behavior-driven, where you are writing the tests in a language that is closer to, sorry to be Anglo-centric, but closer to spoken English, and then the framework translates your English-like tests into commands that BHAT will run. BHAT has a bunch of built-in ones for very common testing things, but BHAT will prompt you to write things that don't exist. So it's for behavior, so you're more like trying to verify the behavior of your application. Think of it more as integration tests as opposed to trying to focus on one individual unit of code working. PHP spec is similar to BHAT. They're using specifications where you're doing the same type of thing as BHAT, where you're kind of saying, I'm expecting my code to behave in a certain way, and PHP spec takes care of turning that kind of pseudo-English type of specification into commands that the framework should run. And then just like in PHP unit, where you are writing test cases, you are writing the methods, you are writing code to support you as you write the test. With PHP spec and BHAT, you're doing basically the same thing. So I see we have a question from, let's see here, from Valdis. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is there an easy way to run PHP unit tests within the browser? Nope, command line. Command line is where you're going to live when you want to do really effective testing. Sorry, Simple Test used to be Simple Test was the first unit testing tool I worked with. I supported in the browser. It only worked in the browser and not in the command line. And I think the problem with wanting to have unit testing tools that run in the browser is that they become extremely difficult to run in a continuous integration environment. So that's why PHP unit is so good. It's built for the command line, so there's no hoops you have to go through to get it to work. So someone asked me, do I advocate lots of mocks? If so, do you ever get the feeling that you aren't actually testing anything, and how do you get past the feeling? So yes, I do use mocks. I believe that actually mocks are actually a really good way to tell if your code is overly complex. If you're having to do a lot of mocks in order to make a testing scenario work, chances are that you have an object that you're testing that is doing too much. Everyone is familiar kind of with the God object idea, large classes, 20 or 30 methods on them, where if you start looking at things that like, what is this object responsible for doing, and what are these how are these methods supposed to be manipulating the state of the object, you'll quickly realize that excuse me, you'll quickly realize that you have some design mistakes, and that's a clear sign. People talk about code smells. Having to do excessive mocking is a test smell. It means that you have a test scenario that's really complicated, and that the object that you're trying to test can't do it without a lot of help. So I do use mocks because I believe that mocks are the only way to test third-party things that aren't under your control, to put them into a proper state as a dependency. I mock things like database connections, calls to remote APIs, things like that. Anything that I don't directly control, I mock. Anything that I do control, I try to look at it and say, is there a way for me to create this dependency, a real version of the dependency within the test, so I don't have to mock it? So excessive mocking is clearly a sign that there's some problems with the code itself. So how do you test message queues? That's a good question. I test those with integration tests. So I do write integration tests from time to time where I use the real things. So to write an integration test with something like Beanstalk or RabbitMQ or any one of these things is that I would need to set up an environment where I have real versions of those tools available, real versions of the data set from production. So often you find yourself needing to create tools to migrate data from one environment to the other. Those are a pain in the ass to write. So sometimes those are good to invest time in as well, so you can move complete data sets from production into staging. And then, I would just I would use PHP unit to write tests as if I was writing a unit test. And instead of doing mocks, I use the real things. For the Open CFP project that I work on, code coverage is shamefully low because I had to crank out a whole bunch of stuff for a deadline for my own conference. So I'm now going back and I am writing some semi-integration tests because the application is in a state where I can use dependency injection to mock a lot of things such as request objects and database calls and things like that. So that lets me create some effective tests and make sure that basically I'm trying to prove that the code that I've written in my controllers, because it's your typical MVC app, that they work correctly. So how do you test event-driven systems? You don't. That's kind of the last frontier for testing, I think, is frameworks that allow you to easily test event-driven applications as a whole. I can recommend testing the individual stuff inside your application that's event-driven to make sure that the individual units of code that get called as part of the event loop work correctly, but otherwise, you're kind of stuck with functional tests using things like bhat with Mink to write those tests. The problem with trying to test event-driven stuff and also the sequence of events is that it's extremely difficult to control the sequence of things. You can't always control it for reasons that are out of your hand with event loops. That's kind of my experience. Every single time I've tried to try to write things to test event-driven systems and try to force things to happen in a particular sequence, it didn't work well. I focused instead on testing whatever things are being called as part of the event loop. If you want to take a page out of some other people's thoughts on this sort of thing, people say that when you're building these apps, you shouldn't be writing tests for the controllers in an MVC style app. If you think of the event loop for an event-driven application as the controller, it makes total sense. Test the things that are going to get called in the event loop and do your best to mock the dependencies and simulate the type of responses that are expected. I mean, this is a much bigger problem if you're using something like Node. With PHP, I could probably count on two hands the number of large-scale applications that are using event-driven stuff in PHP. All right, so Ryan asked a question, when working with multiple APIs, do you skip certain tests or do you need to go get mock responses for every possible API call scenario and write tests for both success and failures? That's a good question. A lot of it depends on what your goal for your tests. If your test is for critical stuff and you want to test your API, then, I mean, if we start off at the high level, yes, you want to test every response and as many combinations that are critical. When you do your API calls. Again, there are no black and white rules for a lot of this stuff. You want to have enough. Basically, what you're looking for is enough tests that give you confidence that the thing isn't broken, and also give you confidence that if you change something else, the test will tell you if you've accidentally broken something somewhere else. Because that's kind of what we're trying to do as well. I mentioned before, we're trying to move the cost of bug fixing to a cheaper part of the development cycle. And we're also trying to make sure to guard against regressions, that a change over here, off screen, doesn't break something that's here. So that's kind of what we're looking for. So let's see another one here. Talking about the differences between doubles, dummies, stubs, spies, mocks, and fakes. So yes, I can kind of talk about, I mean, in the PHP community, they're known as mocks because the tools say get mocks, and mockery is my favorite mock tool. So we can talk about them. I can talk about the different type of test doubles a little bit. So the most common ones that the PHP folks end up using are, there's really only two, and sometimes kind of like 2.5. So the two big ones are just what I would call, what I would refer to as a dummy, where we're creating a mock of an object that just has to stand in because we need that type of object to exist as a dependency, not because we need it to do anything, but because we just need it to exist, to satisfy a parameter check as it's passed around. So that's one type. And then the other most common one is basically a stub, where we're creating a test double, and then we're saying, I have this object which is pretending to be this other thing. And I know that I'm expecting these methods, these specific methods to be called. And when these methods are called, I'm expecting specific results to come back. So I would call that a stub. The other common one that was mentioned is the idea of a spy. The concept in testing of test doubles, we talk about spies, is that you're trying to verify that a specific thing was run. So PHP kind of combines those things, PHP unit anyway, combines them in that when you're creating a test double using the get mock and get mock builder tools, you can also specify that you're expecting it to be run a specific number of times. Mockery changes that a little bit, that sometimes you can have it where it doesn't care how many times it's run, just that the method is run. So spies are interesting if you have a test where you're wanting to verify that if I pass in a collection of items, I pass 5 of them, I want to make sure that a method inside this loop that's iterating over the collection is called 5 times. So you could definitely kind of set up some kind of pseudo spy thing. Spies are a lot more common, I have found in my work in doing unit testing for JavaScript, because the tools and JavaScript's own model help you do that a lot easier than you can do it in PHP. You can't really do, with PHP, you can't really do spies to say, this code inside this method run a specific number of times. Sign on is a library I've used for that in JavaScript. It does let me say, hey, I want to know how many times this thing was run. So I hope that answered the question. I have learned to write the test scenario first and then write the functions. That's test-driven development. That's my preferred method of doing things. When I write code, if the testing framework is set up already and there are tests available, I definitely write my tests first and then write code until the tests pass. I think that's the best way to do it when you already know the thing that you want to do. Often what I find is that I write prototypes for things, so non-final versions of them. And then once the idea that I came up with has proven that I can actually implement it, then I go back and I write all the tests for all the things I want to do with that particular bit of code, and then keep writing tests until everything passes. See all the stuff that you learn over 10 years of figuring all this stuff out? It just flows out of my head like water.
We do not have any more questions in the queue right now. So if anyone has questions, please jump in.
So Bill Wheeler obviously must follow me on Twitter because he just commented, "We're proud of you. I haven't yelled yet." No, I get quite animated about these things. I've invested a non-trivial amount of my professional career into learning about testing because I worked on a horrible project early in my career and never wanted to go through that again. And while I mean, I can talk about this a little bit more because Bill does bring up the point about yelling. So when I was younger, I did spend a lot of time complaining and yelling about why people were doing things a certain way. And now it's easier because there are so many other people that believe, maybe not as strongly as I do, but believe in the same ideas. And slowly over time, the body of work that's available for people to learn how to write tests for things and learn how to figure out strategies for dealing with writing tests for legacy code bases. Every day, a little bit more of that information percolates out of people's brains and goes up onto the internet in forms of blogs and screencasts and things like that. I know I'll get labeled as a self-promoter, but I make a nice chunk of my income off of my books and videos and stuff. And so, I mean, I can recommend that people, if people want to learn more about kind of the foundations of getting into writing testable code and learning how to use tools like PHP Unit and the mocking stuff, my 2 books, I mean, of course, I have a vested interest because I like having this little bit extra money because it makes my wife relax and not stress about the time I spend doing these things away from her. So I recommend my books, the Grumpy Programmer's Guide to Building Testable Applications, which kind of touches a little bit on kind of how to refactor your application to make it more testable. I think that's the book that beginners that want to learn how to get into testing will get the most benefit from, because it shows you how to take some actual really crufty, bad PHP code and fix it up. I have been contemplating doing a second edition of the book because I realize there's so much stuff that people don't know and are having a hard time understanding. So that would probably be material that would be really good for a second edition of the book. If you want to learn more about how to use PHP Unit, I have the Grumpy Programmer's PHP Unit Cookbook, which covers most of the basic functionality of PHP Unit, shows you how to install it, shows you how to configure it, shows you how to set it all up. And because the more important real examples on, I want to do X, how do I do it? So for the first book, you can find it at grumpy-testing.com. You can find the PHP Unit Cookbook at grumpy-phpunit.com. I also, on my website, which has been languishing a little bit, if you go to grumpy-learning.com, I have links to a bunch of screencasts that I have done. They are for sale. That kind of talk, again, they talk a lot about what I've talked about during the past 50 minutes or so, of just kind of like real examples on how people do things. The PHP testing bootcamp is probably the one that I would recommend to people. If you want to be honest and talk about numbers, it costs like $100, but in terms of what you're going to learn, if you're a freelancer and you charge, I mean, think of this, you watch these videos, you learn a whole bunch of stuff. You'll make back the money that you spent on my videos in about 2 hours. It's really not a lot of money when you really look at the grand scheme of things. And so, yes, and so a final thing, a bit about me. Someone says, seems like the grumpy programmer is not that grumpy as all. I have to remind people sometimes. A long time ago, I made a decision to create a brand under which to put all my testing efforts. And that decision was the brand was the Grumpy Programmer. And this is a little lesson for people that want to get into marketing and creating their own content. Consistency matters. Branding matters. I came up with the idea of the Grumpy Programmer. I have what I consider to be a very entertaining Twitter account. I am not like the person on Twitter in real life. If I was, I would be unemployable. Because certainly I don't do all the antics that I talk about on Twitter at my day job. So I thank everybody, because we got about 10 minutes left, but I thank everybody for setting aside time from their own personal schedules to come listen to me talk at them about testing stuff and try to answer questions. I welcome feedback from anyone that's attended. You can hit me up on Twitter. I'm Grumpy Programmer without the U. You can email me at any time about anything at chartjes@grumpy-learning.com. I read every email that makes it through my spam filters. I cannot guarantee I answer every single email, but I'm a huge believer in mentoring and trying to pass the knowledge that I have onto other people. So again, they don't have to put up with the bullshit I put up with when I was trying to figure out how to do all these things. So I'm happy to answer questions and try to point people in the right direction as they try to figure out the things that that I had to learn on myself. So like, see me go off on a grumpy bit. No, man, I'm tired today. It's not a good day to go into grumpy rants. If I do have one grumpy rant It's the idea, the concept that developers aren't getting paid to write tests and don't have time to write tests. You're not getting paid to write code, you're getting paid to solve problems. And writing tests is one way to solve problems. And if you work at a place that doesn't believe in that, my suggestion is to remind you that developers such as ourselves are in high demand and well paid, and there's no reason to ever suffer through a piece of shit job because you're not getting to do what you want. There's a nice little bit of grumpiness for you guys. I also want to thank Codementor for inviting me. This was enjoyable. I will probably want to do one of these things again sometime in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
So again, buy my books, buy my videos. That extra money buys me a little bit of time and a little bit of freedom that I can continue to do things like this. Without that extra support, I have to concentrate fully on the day job, and I would rather be able to have fun doing things like this.
Yes. So guys, please buy Chris's book. Yeah. Okay. So if anyone has no other questions, let's call this a day. So thank you so much, Chris.
Also, one more final thing. For those who are watching who happen to attend programming conferences, I'm going to be at ZenCon, which is which is in Santa Clara, California, at the end of October. So if anybody who's watching is thinking about attending, I highly recommend it. It's a good conference. If you do attend, I'm giving 2 talks. Come up and see me. If you haven't bought my books, I'll give you a discount, 50% off if you come up and talk to me. I tend to speak at like half a dozen conferences all over the place. I'm hoping to go back to Europe again to speak in Belgium in February. I'll likely be in Florida in January speaking at Sunshine PHP. I run my own conference that's in the Toronto, Canada area. True North PHP, that's coming up the first weekend in November. So I highly recommend people try to go to conferences, not so much because they get exposed to new ideas, but because they get a chance to meet other like-minded developers. It's very dangerous for your career and your development as a programmer to stay isolated and not make contacts and be in touch with other developers who have similar thoughts and want to do things that are similar to you. Extremely dangerous.
All right. So thank you so much, Chris.
All right, everybody, take care.
All right. Take care, guys. Thank you.